when we want to find an inverse of this, what you do, the first step is fairly simple. You switch the x and y. That's the first step for finding the inverse function or inverse equation. So you switch x and y. Now once you switch x and y, your next goal is to solve for y. So I can get y by itself. And that's where these get a little bit harder. The first initial switch is pretty simple. Now we have to get y by itself to make it y equals. So we could graph it basically. So we could see what the graph would look like. We aren't going to be doing graphs of these. We're just learning to change them. So the first step to get the y by itself, as I see, is we're going to minus the 4 over. So that's gone. And that leaves you with x minus 4 equals the cube root of y minus 2. Now, to get rid of that cube root, to get rid of a cube root, we want to cube both sides. Now, because a cube root is a 1/3 power, is another way of thinking of it, but you don't need to think in fractional powers if you don't want. But basically, to get rid of a cube root, you will need to cube both sides. Because to get rid of a square root, you'd square both sides. To get rid of a cube root, you cube both sides. But hopefully you get used to that. And once we do that, it's kind of nice. You end up with just x minus 4 cubed equals y minus 2. Now it's not plus or minus 2. When you had a square root, it was a plus or minus 2. Okay, but with a cube root, there's no plus or minus. So, last step to get y by itself, it's to add this 2 over. It can't get inside of that, so your answer is y equals x minus 4 cubed plus 2. And that is your inverse function. You could graph this fairly easily if you wanted to. It is a cubic graph with the center at 4, 2. Now let's do another inverse function. So right here we have a parabola. Hopefully you can tell it's an upside down parabola by the negative 2x squared. And I want to make the inverse of this. So like before, you simply switch x and y. So I have x equals 18 minus 2y squared. Now, like before, get y by itself. So we got to use properties to get y by itself. So to get this guy by itself, I think that 18's first to move. So I'm going to minus 18 over. That will give me x minus 18 equals negative 2 over y squared. Okay, now to get that negative 2 off the y squared, it's multiplied on, so let's divide it off. So we're going to divide that guy off. And that would leave you with x minus 18 over negative 2 equals y squared. Now, we could divide everything up and make that like negative 1/2 x plus 9. I'm not going to do that. Let's just leave it like this. You don't need to do a lot of algebraic simplification all the time. But how do we get rid of this? To get rid of a squared, don't you square root? You could also 1/2 power both sides. Got it? Because the square root is a 1/2 power. Whatever works best for you. I'm going to use the square root because to me it just makes sense. To get rid of a squared, I'm going to square root. So as I square root both sides, you just got to be careful here. You have y equals, whenever you square root both sides, you do have a positive or negative. And then you have the x minus 18 over negative 2. All right. Now that would be your answer. When do you have a plus or minus? When you square root both sides. If you cube root both sides, you don't have a plus or minus. Okay, it's only when you square root both sides that you get plus or minuses. All right. Yes. Would this have imaginaries at some point? You should notice this graph would have imaginaries at some point, but we'll talk about it another day. That would be your inverse. There's actually two functions, two graphs to create it.